Great, Bill. Ready to start whenever you are.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Welcome everybody to the very first Oxford Digital Ethnography Group Seminar of Trinity Term. We have a sort of unusually foreshortened schedule this term with just talks this weekend in week 4, and then due to bank holidays and a tradition of not holding a talk in the final week of Trinity Term, we won't have any further talks. So just this week, next in 2 weeks' time, in week 4, we will have somebody called Si Pok Lau, who is a recent DPhil finisher at the university, who's going to talk about the East Asian workers in the gig economy, I think focusing mainly on Japan. So I hope you will be able to join us for that. I'd like to just very briefly introduce our speaker for today, who is Professor Brent Luvaas, and he is a professor of global studies and a graduate faculty member in communication, culture, and media at Drexel University at Philadelphia in the US. His publications include Street Style and Ethnography of Fashion Blogging. That was Bloomsbury 2016, which was 2019 winner of the Society for Visual Anthropology's John Collier Jr. Award for Still Photography, which I guess means that might be an illustrated text. He also authored DIY Style, Fashion, Music, and Global Digital Cultures, Berged 2012. Describes himself as a cultural and visual anthropologist whose work explores how digital technologies shape the way we see and experience the world around us, which is perhaps a fitting segue into his talk today: Green as Ambient Sensibility, CGI Renderings, and the Felt Experience of Southeast Asian Eco-Cities, which I think is an exploration of the imaginative and affective work that CGI renderings, in this case of a yet-to-be-built eco-city in Malaysia, engage in and shape the material landscapes. Engage in and yes. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Brent.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Bill, and thank you all for joining us today. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen. All right. Okay, so a few years back, I was having a conversation with my friend Jenny Cho, who is a China scholar at the University of Southern California, about a recently built development, still being built development in Malaysia, in the Johor Strait, in fact, between Malaysia and Singapore, called Forest City. So this is just a map provided conveniently by Country Gardens, the developer behind Forest City, of where Forest City is located. You can see it's in the Johor Strait, so technically on the Malaysia side, but very close to Singapore. You can see Singapore from Forest City. And this is a planned eco-development, what they're calling an eco-city. And we'll get to what that means in just a minute, which is going to be built out of 3 brand new islands. They're called reclaimed, but in fact, that means simply that they're being built entirely from scratch in what is, in fact, a kind of sea meadow with imported sand that's being dumped in the ocean. Right? So 3 new islands that are going to be a city of eventually about 700,000 people. The developer behind Forest City is a Chinese firm called Country Gardens that makes a lot of these kinds of developments in different parts of the world. And there's been quite a lot of speculation about what Country Gardens, and in fact, the Chinese government that often sponsors and collaborates with Country Gardens, might be interested in about creating this sort of development right across the Johor Strait from Singapore. My friend, Jenny Cho, was interested in hearing about Forest City largely because of its connections with China. And she and I started thinking through and beginning to talk about the various ways that such kinds of developments serve the geopolitical interests of China. I, on the other hand, am a Southeast Asianist. I've done my work largely in Indonesia in my life, although for the last decade or so, my work has been a little bit closer to home, largely in New York and Philadelphia. But I've maintained an interest in Indonesia and the region in which Indonesia is situated. And so she and I were both trying to think through this sort of project, doing a potential project about this area. And let me just show you a little bit about why it was that we were interested in Forest City specifically. So first of all, Forest City is this kind of newly built city that is discussed in very utopian terms. It's often described as an eco-city, a sustainable city, a green city, a smart city, all these terms used interchangeably as if they all meant the same thing, but clearly they do not. It's a city that is designed to be not only pedestrian friendly, but to a certain extent pedestrian exclusive. All of the cars, freeways, parking lots were intended to be underground. So on the surface, all you would see would be green space. And you can see what that is supposed to look like. The renderings that we were encountering of Forest City made it look quite fantastical and intriguing. And you could see that it's sort of modeled in some sense off of the style of HDB housing in Singapore, which is just across the strait. And so there was a kind of continuity there, but it had its own sort of distinct futuristic look. And one of the things that we noticed, of course, right away is this kind of recreational aspect to Forest City. It was always depicted in its renderings as being a place not only where people live, but where people thrive, where people are active, living these active lifestyles, kayaking. There's always kites. There's various kinds of signifiers that people are living this very healthy, happy lifestyle within the domain of Forest City. Rollerblading, right? This is the kind of look that seems to define these sorts of spaces. As we started to pay attention to Forest City, we started to realize that this is one of quite a number of similar developments that are sprouting up across Southeast Asia and indeed large parts of the world. A lot of the Persian Gulf countries are also building similar sorts of developments right now. Saudi Arabia's Neom is the most sort of famous example of this particular moment. But there's quite a lot of similar sorts of developments taking place worldwide. And we became kind of fascinated by the fantastical CGI renderings of these eco-cities. So before I go any further, I just want to say a couple words about what I mean by eco-city. Eco-city is a term that, in fact, is associated with the Berkeley-based architect Richard Register. He wrote a book called Eco-Cities back in the mid-1990s. And he never quite gets around to defining what that term is in the book, right? Is essentially used synonymously with green city, with sustainable city, with carbon neutral city. It tends to refer to these kinds of urban or ex-urban enclaves within a city. It's not typically used to describe a city that is somehow apart from other kind of urban developments, but usually built within a pre-existing urban area or just outside of it. Often this is a kind of necessity because you need, if you're building a city from scratch, right, you need to have some place for people to work, some place for people to shop, some sort of public transportation infrastructure to operate within, right? So eco-cities tend to be built within the domain or right outside of existing cities. They purport to be environmentally friendly, fuel efficient. They purport to be kind of carbon neutral, to have, as their goal, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But the eco-city, as Richard Register used the term, and indeed as the developers and architects that we have been paying attention to use the term, is a much squishier, much more easily universally applied concept that can mean essentially whatever it is that you need it to mean in order to more effectively sell real estate. Right? So we started to think in terms of how it is that eco-cities are being presented, how it is that they're being shown to potential investors, potential buyers, governments, and other kinds of interested bodies to demonstrate a kind of greenness. And as we started to look around, we discovered a number of these eco-cities that are being developed in the region, and I'm just going to show you a few of them now, just as renderings, and then later on, I'm going to show you my experience encountering them in various stages of development. All right, so one of the ones being built right now is Jurong Lake District in Singapore. This is, in fact, a development immediately across the Johor Strait from Forest City, which I've already shown you. Right? About a mile and a half or so from Jurong Lake District is another Singaporean development called Tanga, which also just means center in Malay, which is also being marketed very much as an eco-city. Penang South Islands is one of the more ambitious ones. This is being built right off the coast of Penang. Like Forest City, it is imagined to be 3 islands, although there's been quite a lot of dispute about the environmental impact that building 3 new islands from scratch would have off the coast of Penang. And so currently the plan has been sort of minimized down to simply a single island, which is going to be called Silicon Island, which tells you something about what the intentionality of Malaysia and having this island built is. Malaysia is currently one of the top 5 creators of microchips, and Penang is in a special economic zone that makes it easier to deal with environmental and economic regulations for the manufacture of microchips. So Penang South Islands is very much fitting into this kind of larger plan of Malaysia to establish itself as a major technological center. Penang South Islands, though, really is easy to capture one's attention because it's got all these kind of futuristic tropes. It's got, the sort of standard sort of look of what the eco-cities that we've been looking at tend to have, which is this kind of combination of hyper futuristic kind of building structures with green overgrown kind of landscaping, usually some kind of signifier that we're dealing with the future here. In this case, we have all these like bubble cars that don't in fact exist yet, right? We have these kinds of vague turbine things on the side that are demonstrating that some kind of alternative energy source is being deployed, although it's unclear what that energy source is, right? There's all these various ways in which greenness gets communicated through these renderings. We became interested in the kind of aesthetic work that the renderings do to communicate their greenness without actually making any specific environmental claims, right? We know that this is supposed to be a highly sustainable city. We know it's supposed to be carbon neutral, and we can see that and experience that through the renderings to a certain kind of limited extent. The most ambitious of the eco-city projects that we have been looking at and paying attention to is, in fact, the new planned capital city for Indonesia, a place that I've done a lot of field work over the last 20-odd years. So in case you're not familiar, Jakarta, the current capital of Indonesia, is a greater metropolitan area of about 35 million people. It has recently been rated as one of the most polluted cities on Earth, one of the most traffic congested cities on Earth, and it is also sinking at a rate of something like 11 to 15 centimeters a year. Partly that has to do with simply the weight of buildings, right? You build enough structures in a place, it starts to eventually produce a kind of subsidence, but also has to do with the fact that there's no potable water being provided to the citizens of Jakarta, so people dig their own wells, and this process of hundreds of wells being dug around Jakarta is resulting in a kind of sinking Jakarta at the same time, of course, as sea levels are rising. And so this presents a real predicament for Jakarta. So the government of Indonesia has decided one way of dealing with that predicament is to simply move the government out of Jakarta, relieve some of the pressure on Jakarta, but also make sure that there is a place for the government actually to reside, because Jakarta's future looks a little uncertain at the moment. Right? So the government of Indonesia has decided to move the capital city from Jakarta up into East Kalimantan to an area about an hour and a half by car outside of Balikpapan, that is going to be known as IKN Nusantara. So IKN just means Ibu Kota Negara, or capital city. Nusantara is the old Javanese word for the Indonesian archipelago. And this is going to be a city that is built right in the midst of the rainforest. So Forest City makes also, it calls itself Forest City, but Nusantara sort of presents itself as a model of what a forest city would look like. It is being built literally in the rainforest, second largest rainforest on Earth. Right? Now, this is mainly land that has been heavily mined, damaged. Timber has been cut there quite extensively. So part of the process of building Forest City has been to begin the process of reforesting this area. Eventually, it's going to be, and this is a claim that almost every one of the cities that we've been looking at has made, the most eco-friendly, carbon neutral, sustainable city the world has ever seen, right? Every one of these cities makes that claim. We have some doubts and suspicions about how that is actually going to play out. Nonetheless, this is a kind of model that has been put forward as what the future of the development is going to look like. Eventually, this is going to be home, by 2045, it's supposed to be home to about 2 million Indonesians. The plan is to begin moving the bureaucrats who are associated with the Indonesian government to Indonesia starting this summer. Right, so it's a pretty narrow timeline. It only started being built 2 years ago, so that's ambitious. This gives you a sense of what that's supposed to look like. So anyway, this is the background. This is what we were working with initially, was these CGI renderings of places that don't yet exist, but are in various stages of planning and development right now. I'm currently on sabbatical. I wanted to use my sabbatical as an opportunity to get over there and see what is actually happening with the physical spaces themselves. So what I wanted to do with the rest of the talk really is just to give you a kind of status update on this project based on my recent research and fieldwork in Southeast Asia, trying to see the reality of the spaces that these CGI renderings have shown. So let's start with where I started, Jurong Lake District in Singapore. I flew into Singapore in January and wanted to see where it was that Jurong Lake District is being created. This is right across the street from the hotel where I was staying in, and shows you, it gives you the sort of QR code that those people who are encountering Jurong Lake District would be able to use to find more information on it. It's currently selling housing units to Singaporeans. So right now, of course, this is basically just state-owned land that's been cordoned off so that no one can access it. There is a relatively large part of undeveloped land there, but a lot of it has already been developed into park space. So this is the Jurong Lake that the Jurong Lake District refers to, which is quite developed already. This is the process of Jurong Lake District being built. And this is the view from my hotel room where it is being built. The hotel I was staying at is in fact about to be demolished so that it can be part of this new eco-city development. What was interesting to me about Jurong Lake District is that as soon as I was there, it was immediately sort of obvious that this is part of this larger kind of industrial zone and business zone in which foreign companies are being attracted to occupy what is essentially sort of like office parks, right? There's a bunch of office parks and industrial space. And it seemed to me quite clear that part of what the Singaporean government is hoping to accomplish through establishing the Jurong Lake District within this sort of confine is to rebrand this industrial park as a much nicer place to live for foreign executives who would be doing business in Singapore. Right, so you had like companies like Acer makes computers, and and various other sort of technology firms that have already established bases there. But it's a really kind of ugly industrial landscape that Singapore is trying to rebrand as this kind of exciting, vibrant place to live. you see, you know, one of the things that I noticed right away, and this became sort of a real sort of theoretical interest of mine as well, is to try to think through the way that the renderings themselves occupy a kind of space within the physical location, right? So there's billboards outside, all of the kinds of construction projects that we're talking about that demonstrate what this space is supposed to be. So there's this kind of implanting in the heads of those people who come into the realm of these newly built eco-cities, what the future space is going to be, and try, you know, this kind of work of the imagination on you know, beginning to the process of reimagining these spaces becomes really evident as you enter into the physical spaces themselves. Jurong Lake District, though, is not empty land, right? And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So one of the things that I wanted to pay attention to is, how is this space currently being used? So on a Sunday night, you have all, you know, all the sort of local people coming out, you know, singing karaoke, hanging out with their kids in various playgrounds and parks, eating dinner, all this kind of stuff. And this, of course, is all being torn up and reimagined and replaced into this new sort of imaginary, much better configuration of urban life, according to the eco-city model, right? So the science center that's currently there that's also about to be torn down. So this is Jurong Lake District. From there, I walked over to Tanga, which I found on Google Maps. And on Google Maps, it appears as just the largest green space I could find on the entire island of Singapore. Right? So I was imagining this very sort of lush, beautiful space that I could potentially get to. And I keep walking towards it. I'm walking through a number of housing developments on the way there. I keep not seeing this giant green space that the map is promising me. Right? I pass one little tiny green space, like, you know, up on the hill, and I'm like, you know, beginning to sort of get a sense in my head of what this lush green landscape that Tanga is going to be built on looks like. But when I get there, I realized, you know, it took me a while to actually realize that I had finally arrived at that green space, because the entire thing looked like this. And I realized that, you know, that Singapore has been, you know, I've been reading articles about Tanga for a while, and the kind of pushback that the Singaporean government had been getting about Tanga is that it was taking an actually functioning natural space within Singapore and transforming it into a kind of approximation of greenness, right? So what it was doing, it was ripping up all of the existing trees and natural landscape, putting in buildings that eventually would, of course, have the greenery re-added. Right, so it was quite a massive area. I wandered around for a couple hours in the heat and sun, sort of taking pictures and sort of documenting what this process of building it looked like. And frankly, I found it kind of discouraging and bleak to see this natural landscape like decimated in the name of greenness. But that is sort of the thing that the eco-city requires. They're already building the public transportation to make it to Tanga. It's been now, you know, 2 months since I've been there, so I'm guessing it has come considerably further than it had already. And once again, you see all of these renderings within the physical space itself that work to trigger the imagination, to begin to shape the expectations of those potential buyers and residents, also to kind of counter the concerns that in various environmental activists might have put forward about what is eventually going to be there. This way in which the renderings kind of impose themselves as a kind of dominant vision within physical space that struck me as really quite interesting and worthy of documentation. So I spent a lot of time just taking pictures of the renderings as they appear within the spaces that they are meant to define and describe and serve as a blueprint for. So after I was in Tanga, you know, went back to Jurong Lake District, from where you can very easily take a bus to get over to Malaysia. And that becomes the, you know, that sort of bus system is the easiest route for Singaporeans to get over to Malaysia. The bus system now, just a month before I got there, now added a new stop. So you can actually get directly from Jurong Lake District to Forest City. So that's where I went from there. This is the first shot that I saw of Forest City. Forest City has the unique advantage of actually, to a certain extent, existing, right? As opposed to most of the other projects that I've been talking about so far. So this is from the second link, which is the big bridge between Singapore and Malaysia. And you can see Forest City in the distance. It becomes now the first part of Malaysia that you see. No doubt designed that way so that that Malaysia also gets this sort of added advantage of having this sort of powerful looking skyscape that dominates the skyline as you're entering into Malaysia. And it looked very much like the renderings at first glance, right? It has the same kind of feel as them. However, when I finally arrived in Forest City, the very first thing that I notice, of course, is the roads. If you remember from the beginning of my talk, Forest City isn't supposed to have them, or rather, they're supposed to be underground. But one of the challenges of building an eco-city is that in order to build a carbon neutral zone, you have to create all of these roadways and use all sorts of machinery that is itself heavily carbon intensive, right? So how do you get to the place that you're going to be building as a carbon neutral zone? Well, you have to build roadways to do that. And until, of course, there's a public transportation line that goes into Forest City, those roads become quite critical. So I was quite disappointed to discover the roads when I first got there. Also to discover that there was no way to get to the Airbnb that I was staying at without walking on the roads, right? Because one thing that they had neglected to do to create this pedestrian haven was create actual pedestrian zones, right? So there were no sidewalks, there were no walkways, there's only roadways currently in Forest City. This is the view from the Airbnb that I was staying at. All of the units that are lower to the ground over here are the townhouse units, which are selling for millions of dollars as opposed to hundreds of thousands. And those, I could see at night, appear to be entirely unoccupied. So Forest City has a planned population of about 700,000. Its current population is somewhere between 7 and 10,000. And it's very difficult to tell exactly who it is that is a permanent resident in Forest City from who is a kind of curious gawker who has come to see Forest City. And right now, Forest City is largely benefiting from its reputation as being kind of a ghost town. So Malaysians are now getting Airbnbs simply so they can have the experience of staying in something of a ghost town. I was on the 37th floor. I believe I was the only person on the 37th floor looking out at an apartment complex that had at night about 4 lights in it for a unit that can house several hundred, right? So there's something really eerie about that sensation, and it actually sort of recommended, except that it's something that is not something that you enjoy for very long, right? What I wanted you to see is that this is Jurong right across the strait, right? So you're staring at Singapore, you're staring at a city, at another eco-city development, in fact, that's about to be created, which is itself by design. Forest City already had, they started construction in 2016. It's being built on reclaimed sand. It turns out reclaimed sand is not as stable as ground that it naturally forms. So already you're beginning to see sort of cracks in the facades of the buildings. Part of the ground that they had laid is now is now gradually transforming into swampland. There are this sort of overgrown aesthetic that's been a big part of how Forest City has marketed itself is certainly dominant still, but most of the plants that are covering the buildings are in fact imported plants, right? It's sort of cheap imported plants that create the effect of greenness, but don't necessarily adhere to the principles of sustainability that their designers had in mind. You can see the roads are already being sort of compromised by the shifting sands underneath the base of the buildings. It's just giving you a sense of the sort of swampy kind of overtaking of of this kind of man-made space by the natural environment surrounding it. In the background here, we have the international school that is going to eventually be serving a large portion of the population. The pyramid-like buildings are intended to be office towers, so that the people who live in the residential buildings won't have to go very far to get to work. They can just walk over to the office towers. There's supposed to be several dozen of these office towers. There's currently one. So it tells you about how easily they've been able to attract residents to those towers. Just to give you a sense of what all this looks like. You know, as a visual anthropologist, one of my primary interests in these kinds of spaces is their aesthetics and their visuality, and trying to figure out how to document them visually. And so for me, one of the biggest challenges of this project so far has been to try to figure out how to make interesting images out of it that isn't just this kind of, okay, so the renderings promised us this one thing, but the actuality is something else, right? That's a photojournalistic kind of way of approaching the project, which I think has value, but is not necessarily interesting in and of itself. I'm much more interested in the ways in which the realities, the representations, the digital representations of the place and the place itself intersect and interact within physical locations. And so, the kinds of images that I ended up producing there were largely ones that were about that play or about that representational relationship. So this image, for instance, of an abandoned storefront, right? It's a business that had been occupied. It was intended to be an interior design shop, already abandoned, with a painting of the surrounding landscape in it, but of course, with a reflection so that you can't actually tell what's part of that painting and what is the surrounding landscape, sort of playing with this sort of relationship. The primary businesses that do exist in Forest City so far are duty-free shops selling alcohol and tobacco. Forest City built itself in a special economic zone. It's if it ultimately ends up being successful, it will largely be because it has this kind of special economic status that attracts businesses who don't have to deal with the same degree of regulations as the rest of Malaysia does. And right now, the primary way that's being taken advantage of is by selling alcohol. And most of the social activity that is observable within Forest City, in fact, takes place around these duty-free shops. People buy it, then camp out on the beach, the man-made beach right out in front. And, that's sort of how it works. More of these storefronts, interested in this sort of ghost-like quality of abandoned space, of course. Fashion malls that will potentially be built but are currently locked off. Stairways to nowhere. Lots of feral dogs. Right. It is used space. It is simply not being used so much by human beings at present. Because there are so few people around, Forest City has tried to make up for that by building statues that sort of stand in for people and other kinds of creatures around. You can see the prime model of future city claim is still being made by Forest City in signage on the beach. Unfortunately, it's marketing itself as a beach city, but I'm not sure if you can actually read the sign in the background, but it says, danger, crocodiles do not swim. So talking to people in Forest City, it's unclear whether there really are crocodiles around, but one local resident claimed to see one time, and now they're being cautious and not allowing anyone in the water anymore. And there are these guards that are dressed sort of like U.S. naval officers in like all white and black outfits with epaulets and the full sort of military regalia that stand around just about everywhere that you go in Forest City, preventing you from going in the water and of taking any kind of pictures that are not with a smartphone. So I was not using a smartphone for these pictures. I had to be very careful to not attract too much attention from the guards as I was doing this. More of the sort of statues standing in for the human population. These ones have seen better days. All right, just showing you a little bit more of what it was that I was trying to see in Forest City. But once again, the renderings of Forest City are very much present within the city itself. They're scattered around the city, reminding residents of what their city is supposed to be. It becomes a kind of spectral reminder of what their city is currently, right? You can't help but be aware of the promise of Forest City while in the current Forest City, which of course does not live up to that promise. Also, Forest City has this very large, rather impressive sales gallery right in the center of it. It's the most dominant building. In fact, it's this sort of curved building that we're looking into. In this shot, this is a reflection shot, so it becomes a little hard to figure out, but that's what it is that we're looking at. You're not supposed to take pictures in there, so I just did it with my smartphone. But this shows you what the model units are supposed to be like. Shows you ideally what it's going to be like in the future. There's a large-scale model of what Forest City is ultimately going to be. Has no roads, you may notice. It's very much the sort of original version of Forest City, which is quite out of sync with the version that people are living in currently. I should say that Forest City, I think I mentioned that Forest City is supposed to have 3 islands. It currently only has 1. Because they've only sold a small portion of those islands. And another anthropologist that I've talked to who's doing research on Forest City tells me that she was able to find out from the sales office that they're selling about 1 unit per month. So this is not a hugely promising endeavor so far, but this could change. And it could change primarily because one of the primary stakeholders in Forest City is the Sultan of Johor Bahru, which is the region in which Forest City is built. He's about 60% stake owner, and he is influencing the Malay government right now to create a subway line in Forest City and eventually to create Forest City's own immigration checkpoint so that people will be able to be transported immediately from Singapore to Forest City. And the goal is to create a kind of high-speed train line with its own sort of bridge that goes directly to Forest City. And of course, if that happens, that will radically change the fate of this kind of complex and make it a much more viable sort of option. All right, I'm just going to show you really briefly what I found in Penang South Islands, which is a whole lot of nothing, right? Penang South Islands, start date for construction keeps being pushed back. It has now started allegedly the land reclamation process, but I don't have a drone, so I couldn't fly over and see whether that was actually happening. The whole area surrounding it is private property, and I wasn't able to get anywhere near it, but you can see sort of vaguely where the project is supposed to take place and be built. I couldn't see any evidence that it is being built. And that takes us to the final one that we had been paying attention to, which is to say IKN Nusantara in Indonesia. So I flew from Kuala Lumpur over to Balikpapan to try to get to Nusantara, and that turned out to be a little bit more challenging than I anticipated. So Balikpapan is an oil and timber city, the second highest GDP in Indonesia, and is a city primarily of immigrants from other parts of Indonesia. There's not a huge local population there. And it's meant to be the gateway to Nusantara. So, Nusantara is presented as being this kind of Indonesia's claim to being a major player in sustainability and in environmentally friendly, or climate neutral kinds of housing and development. But currently, the area that's surrounding it is not the most well-stewarded area, I have to say. So this is the beach all around Balikpapan, which is going to be the sort of gateway to Nusantara for the foreseeable future. It's a bunch of kids following me around. It took me a couple of days to find a tour company that was willing to take me out to Nusantara. It had been a tourist destination prior to my arrival, but construction was making it difficult to get out there at all. This is a little way station right at the edge of Nusantara that sort of demonstrates the timeline for completion. And you can see that it extends all the way into 2045. But the first stage of completion is supposed to happen this summer. So the first set of bureaucrats, government employees are supposed to begin moving out there this summer. The military is supposed to move out next year. We'll see if any of that happens. What you have right now is a kind of large construction site and efforts to replant trees. So a big part of the selling points of Nusantara is that it's a project that is not destroying the rainforest, but rebuilding the rainforest, right? And there's a process of reforestation that's happening throughout it. And they're supposed to be planting tens of thousands of trees a year. From what I can tell, they've planted exactly one type of tree so far, which is a eucalyptus that is native to the islands off of Sumatra. So it's not, in fact, native to this area of Kalimantan. And they've planted quite a lot of them, but whether that's going to be able to mimic the biodiversity of that region retains a pretty strong lack of clarity. So right now, what we have in Nusantara is simply a kind of tourist site where people come and imagine what Nusantara might be like. And the thing that attracts them is called Titik Nol Nusantara, which is, or translated as ground zero. This is the lowest point in Nusantara. And, to sort of enhance its symbolic appeal, has this circle right in front that contains dirt from all the provinces of Indonesia. And one is, sort of supposed to imagine that somehow this like brings all Indonesians together. There is an indigenous population in Nusantara that is being displaced by this project, of course, right? They're the Balik people. And now their presence within this space is largely as a kind of novelty tourist attraction, right? So these are not actually Balik people, right? But they are dressed up in an imitation of Balik attire to take pictures with tourists who come to see the site. There I am at Titik Nol Nusantara, acknowledging what it could potentially be eventually with everyone else. And you see, of course, this is a quick shot taken from the road, but you see all of these barriers preventing access to the actual space of Nusantara that proclaim what Nusantara will eventually be, that contain these CGI renderings throughout them. So I think I better stop there so I make sure that we have time for Q&A. There's a lot of other things that I wanted to get to, but maybe they will come up naturally within conversation. So I'm just going to open it up to the group at this point.
Thank you very much, Brent, for that super stimulating talk. A lot of food for thought there. I've got a lot of thoughts going through my mind, and I guess people are starting to get their thoughts and questions and together. You can either just raise your hand or put those in chat if you wish, and Nathan and I will keep an eye on the chat. I don't know if anybody has any immediate questions to start us off.
I'm happy to start with one while people gather their thoughts together. Really enjoyed that, Brent. That was fantastic. The image of the kind of stairways to nowhere, the kind of Jaws style, the beach is closed because these like phantom maybe creatures lurking in the deep. I thought it was fantastic. The question I had was a bit about, there are so many different conceptions of kind of space going on here in terms like real space, the planned space, the virtual, and these instances where you kind of, they're all together. So you have the billboard in the space, or you have you're interacting with your phone, which says it's green because it's a kind of planning concept of green, but doesn't bear any reality to the world. I thought it was fantastic. In terms of just islands as a space, I guess you talk about like forest cities and then island cities. And obviously these islands have a kind of infrastructural possibility because you can build somewhere on kind of terra nullius, which is great. They also have a kind of like regulatory potential to be special economic zones. I guess I was wondering, like, when you were looking at these images, if there was something kind of like discursive or aesthetic about like the island as a particular type of space that you thought was like particularly interesting, as well as these kind of other affordances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. For me, the way I'd been conceptualizing the island and the significance of the island is that the island is literally new land, right? These are not being built on islands. Islands are being built to house these visions. And there's a kind of sense, I think, that there's something incommensurable between the realities of the spaces that as they currently exist and the utopian vision that is being projected. There's this sense that like it's impossible to imagine Balikpapan, which is a little bit trashed infrastructurally, as being this utopian, deeply sustainable kinds of landscape. And so you have to imagine something new within that sort of space. And so I think that's what's happening here. Is the island represents a unique opportunity to start from scratch. You dump the sand down, you build these new structures that are going to somehow undo the past relationship with the land that existed within that space. And I think it particularly in places with really long histories of poor stewardship, right? It becomes a challenge to convince investors and whatnot that you can do this, and so you have to kind of create from scratch this new vision. Let's see, Dora?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much, Brent, for this wonderful talk. I was looking at all the pictures. I think they were quite nicely taken, and it was quite informative as well. I have a little question about kind of how the people who are right now inside of these areas, like the forest city or the island, I know that a lot of the places are currently unoccupied. I was just wondering if you have encountered any specific people or person who you get to talk with, and how do they themselves kind of perceive whatever is going on or perceive the so-called green space? And in particular, kind of like how do they perceive the CGI renderings that you can even see as advertisements that's like on the street everywhere?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, there are a number of people I encountered, and the encounters were somewhat different depending on the location. So in Forest City, largely the people that I would meet there, because there's so few residents, were people who worked in the shops or restaurants that do exist. So a large portion of the restaurants in Forest City currently are owned by immigrants from mainland China, who are also the sort of primary investors that the developers are trying to reach, right? So there's a kind of continuity with that. The Malaysians that I met there were largely of Tamil background, and were people who had basically moved there on the speculation that eventually this would be a place to be, and that it would be a good investment to buy it now while it's so cheap. Whether that pays off for them is a source of continuing anxiety for them, right? Because it's very difficult to know whether or not this thing can fulfill the vision that it's supposed to be. In Nusantara, in contrast, the people that are there currently are primarily people who are either actively in the process of building it, right? They're people who have been imported from all over Indonesia. Basically, they've come over to find a job opportunity temporarily, or they're people who are trying to serve the people who are building those spaces. So the people I would encounter in Nusantara, the only people, are people who are trying to take advantage of this new population of construction workers. So it's people who are selling noodles, or doing laundry services, or there's one hotel there now, right? And it's basically there's this whole shanty town that is built up around this future city that is supposed to be the absolute antithesis of everything that Jakarta and other major cities in Indonesia are supposed to be. But the shanty towns that have been built to service the workers that are creating Nusantara look exactly like the shanty towns in Jakarta and everywhere else in Indonesia that they're attempting to be the opposite of. It's really interesting to see what happens to those makeshift towns once Nusantara has been proclaimed to be completed. My guess is a similar thing that happened to like Brasilia, where you just clear them out afterwards, right? And I suspect that's what's going to happen. But you know, since there's no prioritizing of housing for service workers in Nusantara, I have no idea whether it can happen within the next 20 years. You know, my guess is it's going to be much more established by then.
Yeah, that was.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Laura.
Oh yeah, I was just like wondering because when I saw the CGI renderings that you showed at the very beginning of the talk, I was kind of noticing the people picture in there. You know, it's kind of like a bunch of people who are at various ethnicities, race categories, age groups, and they just seem to be like gathering happily and doing, you know, like leisure things. So I was kind of like just wondering if, you know, the population right now in reality would be quite different or, you know, so yeah, that was quite informative. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I do think that the racial harmony fantasy is a key part of the kind of vision that the renderings are constructing, and certainly a big part of the imagination that surrounds these eco-cities. At present, you know, it feels like there's the two populations that I encountered in Forest City were, you know, mainland Chinese and local Indian, and there didn't seem to be an enormous amount of interaction between those two populations, right? They kept to themselves. But who knows? We may see some more harmonious vision coming in the future. Jillian?
Yeah, hi Brent, thank you for that. Really interesting. So I'm a geographer and I've worked with Monica Deegan and Claire Melhuish, and we've written quite a bit actually about the production of these computer-generated images in relation to a big new development in Doha in Qatar.
Right.
And you know, an awful lot of very similar themes coming through. So for example, the picturing of the diverse people, and you know, they're cut and pasted from image banks, and the Qataris found that Qataris were not represented very well in these image banks. So there was a photo shoot in a studio in North London to invent the appropriate kinds of, you know, I mean, so they're absolutely fascinating, I think. But I think they also raise, and this is what I wanted to ask you about, some quite sort of fundamental questions actually about what's going on in relation to the visual in digital culture now, because it seems to me that you know, they're very easy to laugh at, and everybody does. You know, we're all cynical about these, you know, yeah, because as you say, they look the same wherever they are. They're very easy to criticize in terms of their green credentials. Neon seems to be disappearing into the sands, doesn't it? I think, you know, having got all sorts of criticism. But one of the things we found in the Doha project was that although they're easy to criticize, certainly in Doha, they were actually very powerful forms of designing the actual built environment. So the kind of wireframe, to put it crudely, you know, the wireframe models that the architects were producing in their software were being imported directly into 3ds Max to produce these visualizations. So there was actually a very powerful connection between the material environment that was being produced and these models. So I think that's a kind of spatial realism, which is a bit different from the visual realism that photography plays on. And also, I think the purpose of a lot of these images is not really to be decoded in, obviously, you know, not in anthropological seminars, but even really on the billboard. That I think they're meant to be seen on screens, or you know, as people scroll through their social media feeds, or indeed as you drive past a billboard. Yeah. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts more generally about, you know, how you were thinking around the sort of visual and the role of the visual in this kind of advertising these big projects, because yeah, as I say, I think things are changing a little bit with their extensive use, various kinds of contexts.
Right. Well, thank you for that question. There's a lot to think through with that. So I would say one thing that has to be acknowledged is that increasingly we're not just talking about visual renderings, but we're talking about much more immersive, you know, 3D and virtual reality kinds of experiences where you're supposed to get the full sound and visionscape of those spaces. And I think that, you know, the key sort of thing that renderings do, besides lay out a kind of vision of what ultimately the project will become, is to instill in their audiences a particular kind of feeling, right? They're supposed to trigger a kind of sensory response. It's supposed to feel like, first of all, a kind of hopeful possible reality that might occupy that space, but it's also supposed to counter the various kinds of claims that environmental activists have been making, that various critics within the governments of Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia have put forward, which is to counter the kinds of green claims. As you mentioned, it's easy to criticize the green claims that these renderings try to put forward. But I think that a lot of the functionality is meant to stimulate in us that sensory experience of greenness that kind of mutes that criticism, so that it's not just that, it's putting forward a kind of vision, but it's putting forward a kind of optimism, a kind of sensory experience of what that space could sort of be, that we're supposed to then project onto the physical landscape, ultimately. So I think that sensory overload, that kind of like creating an overpowering feeling of greenness, is really a large function that those renderings are meant to serve.
Other questions? I have a question. It's very general, and I think it has more to do with the politics of infrastructure, large infrastructure projects, partly. It just so happens this morning on BBC Radio, I heard a Green Party candidate, I think it was up in Scotland, who was talking about the importance of having storytellers in the party who can render this future and communicate it to the population. And that was something that was very important for the Green Party to do. A very important role for the Green Party was to kind of articulate the vision. I'm thinking of an infrastructure project in California, high-speed rail, which is a little bit different sort of thing, but that I'm a little bit familiar with. And there again, the politics are complicated, and one of the main issues is to try to articulate what this is going to do for people who can't easily see it.
Yeah.
Futuristic project. So I wanted to ask a little bit, I guess, about the politics of these cities in their context. I mean, presumably some of these are involving large amounts of taxpayer dollars, some maybe more privately funded. Is there a hearts and minds aspect to this, of having to sort of bring the population on board? Is it more of a centralized project that doesn't really involve the people that much? I mean, I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about the politics, because it seems like these CGI renderings are pretty central in fulfilling that kind of role of articulating the vision of what this will one day be, and to sell it in the present and keep it on the rails, so to speak, to use the high-speed rail analogy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. That forecasting this kind of rosy future and telling a story about the potentiality of a project that is currently not anywhere near what that sort of vision is really a key sort of function. So yeah, the politics are different, obviously, depending on the space that we're talking about. I'll say a little bit about maybe Forest City and Nusantara's political situations, because they're somewhat different. In Forest City, there is a huge concern, in fact, that that has been articulated quite a lot by government bodies, that Forest City is a kind of ploy to gain influence over Malaysian politics by China. And this is partly because Country Gardens is a Chinese company, and just like the United States is trying to get rid of TikTok because of imagined Chinese influence, there's something similar going on with Country Gardens, where there's this appeal largely to a Chinese market to come move to Forest City, and there's a concern, which is not insubstantial, right, that because Malaysia grants or allows homeowners within Malaysia to apply for voting rights, that if 700,000 largely Chinese, mainland Chinese residents eventually occupy Forest City, that gives an enormous amount of influence to Chinese political interests over the electoral process in Malaysia. Also, it should be pointed out that building a city in the Johor Strait gives you access to shipping routes that have been dominated by Singapore. And Sarah Moser, for instance, has made arguments about that Forest City may very well be a ploy by China to sort of compete with Singapore directly over access to those trade routes. So that sort of politics has been really quite fraught in Malaysia, and there's been a lot of criticism of the project on those grounds. Indonesia's politics are somewhat different. The concerns in Indonesia have largely been about whether or not this is simply a vanity project of Jokowi, the outgoing president of Indonesia, and whether it's actually going to do any good for Jakarta at all. One of the presidential candidates, so while I was in Indonesia, Indonesia had an election, and the defense minister Prabowo is now the president-elect of Indonesia, but one of his competitors ran on a campaign of like, if I become president, I'm going to stop this Nusantara bullshit, and we're going to use the money that we would have used for Nusantara to make Jakarta better, right? Which had some appeal, but apparently not quite enough. So a lot of the funding issue becomes, I think, more pronounced in the Nusantara case, because Malaysia, we're largely talking about private money. It is not being funded by the Malay government. But Nusantara is being primarily funded currently by the Indonesian government. They're supplying some, what did they say? I think it's something like $20 billion or something towards the effort of building it. They're hoping to find outside investors for the rest of it, but they're having a really difficult time doing that, largely because, frankly, investors are not convinced this is something that is ever going to be real. Right? They have reason to be doubtful about that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, Dora.
Yeah.
Yes, because I thought that there's like a very interesting thing, comment that you just made when you were answering Julian's question, which is about kind of like the CGI renderings, you're kind of creating this overall sensory experience of greenness that kind of is having kind of like a power of muting. And the reason why I'm here in this talk is because I do specific research on the sensory experience of greenness. So that was quite interesting for me, but I do kind of approach it from a healthy eating perspective. So it's like actually about meals and food that people eat. But I was also just wondering about this overall sensory experience you were just talking about, because you also mentioned how, say, all of these definitions of eco city, forest city, there are several terms. I think I also noticed sustainable city, carbon neutral city, like all these are quite very hardly defined. It's just like a really vague term that people always use, and then all of these kind of several phrases are kind of used interchangeably, although they actually have quite different meanings. And I was just wondering, would it be possible that you think, in a way, this really vague definition of whatever people are trying to build actually helped to mute? Because whenever you see this CGI rendering, it's kind of like just kind of conveying whatever it wants to say to people, and it's really hard to kind of in a way refute that this is not really it, because the definition itself is kind of really conceived vaguely, and there's no clear definition. Be like, oh, if we define everything in figures, then we can probably just say, oh, the numbers don't match, and then therefore this is not actually what's happening. But then because the definition is quite vague, there's like quite like this overall sensory experience of green is really hard to actually measure. Do you think that also was a really important trait that it carries?
I do. I think the vagueness of the concept allows it to be used in all sorts of contexts, and as you suggest, to counter various kinds of claims about how this isn't really going to be sustainable, this isn't really going to serve to be carbon neutral, and you can always refute it with this, like, well, we didn't make that claim. We made the claim of it being green, a green city. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a particular kind of feeling. It's a particular kind of sensibility. So I have a growing number of architectural texts that are about green architecture or sustainable architecture. And it's remarkable, almost none of these texts define what they mean by that. And what green can mean is so in architectural kind of terminology, it can mean carbon neutral, it can mean energy efficient, it can mean minimal impact on the environment, but it can also simply mean connotes natural, right? It can mean overgrown with plants. It can mean it mimics the experience of being in nature for the people who are occupying that space. And so I think, yeah, there's a real utility to keeping the term green as vague and undefined as possible.
I have one other question. Just also to add, I thought that idea of like digging into greenness and how it conceptually slips between like an effective experience of what looks green and green as this kind of eco concept. And I was wondering about a green that is kind of like varied and diverse and rich versus you were talking about kind of the monoculturalness of it's just eucalyptus, like let's get as much green as possible without any kind of like real rich variety. I had one question which is about the role of these European design. You were talking about this Danish design firm, and I guess yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about like these global design firms that do different projects and presumably can kind of like transpose things and put it in a slightly different vernacular. And I wondered, yeah, if you had any more thoughts about these kind of firms within the.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the sort of starchitecture system in which people are drawing their designs, because there is this kind of global economy of design in which the sort of high prestige firms are largely located, as you suggested, in either in the Netherlands or Scandinavia. There's a lot in Denmark. The Danish firm Big, or Bjarke Engels Group, is responsible for Penang South Islands. The design of Forest City is associated with Sasaki Associates, which is out of Boston, but they're a global firm. They have branches in a number of other places as well. And there's something about attracting these kinds of major international firms that has been deeply appealing to the governments that end up sort of ultimately signing off on these projects. And I think it becomes a way to get governments to sign off on it and to market it more effectively to potential investors and buyers, because it has this kind of global reputation attached to it already. Indonesia is a somewhat different case. With Nusantara, in fact, the competition for the winning design was held only in Indonesia, and it was held largely with a concern of having undue foreign influence on what the Indonesian capital would ultimately be. And it was framed largely in a kind of post-colonial discourse of making sure that that the vision of the new capital was a local vision of that capital. And that was also done in contrast to another major project that's happening right now or actually kind of stalled out right now in Jakarta, which is a seawall project to create a giant wall that's going to be the new downtown core of Jakarta in the shape of the mythical Garuda bird that has been designed by a Dutch firm. And since Indonesia was a Dutch colony, that makes a lot of Indonesians very uncomfortable that this is a way for the former colonizer to reassert itself within Indonesia. So in the Indonesian case, keeping the design local was really imperative.
Any other questions, comments?
I wondered, another question I had was, I was struck by how often the great thing about these images, because they're not photos, is you can kind of have like a temporal flattening. So I was struck by, like, often you see kind of like, oh, it's an eternal, cherry blossom spring. As in a moment of a week within the year is suddenly, and I guess, yeah, I wondered, you spent a lot of time looking at these images, if there were any other instances of kind of like uh temporal collapse or flattening, where you kind of start to pick up on, oh, it's both springtime and there's this type of bird, and they wouldn't be there at the same time, or there's like I guess, yeah, just more a comment, a question on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. That's something I'll need to think about a little bit more. But the first thing that immediately pops into mind, right, is the cherry blossoms referring to a spring that Southeast Asia does not, in fact, experience, right? So already we see the imposition of a design aesthetic and an understanding of the natural environment that is imported from elsewhere, right?
Fascinating.
And I think you do, but I do think you're right, that there is this kind of temporal flattening that defines a lot of these images, this sense of simultaneous seasonality, when in fact, for this region of Southeast Asia, we're talking about 2 seasons, hot and dry and hot and wet. And a lot of the flora that's being depicted is not native to the region in these images. And so what it means for them to be forest cities, natural cities, in harmony with the environment, all of these things are very contentious.
Great. I mean, I have one other question, and I think you alluded to it in your talk a little bit, but it has to do a little bit with, and I guess it's harkening back to Nathan's original question on islands. That has to do with the kind of spatiality, and I'm just wondering if there are any patterns to where news, we have an idea of where you might put a city originally, where might be a good place for a city. Are there any similar patterns or thinking about where generally is a good place for a new city? You mentioned sort of proximity to existing cities as being potentially one. I'm thinking, I did some work on gambling and casinos in East Asia and Southeast Asia a bit, and became interested in where these are located relative to the center. Generally they tend to be on an island or somewhere away from the center. I don't, there's perhaps ethical reasons for that and other reasons. So I'm just wondering if there's any kind of patterns of, green field, brown field, as we call them here. I think that Toyota's Woven City might be on a brownfield site, a former factory that was owned by Toyota. And again, location with regard to proximity to cities, or where in the jungle, those sorts of things. Are there any patterns emerging as far as that goes?
Well, in the Malaysian context, they tend to be in pre-designated special economic zones. So that tells you something really important. They also tend to be in close proximity to another major city, but not technically within them. So they have to be able to take advantage of the pre-existing infrastructure because it takes so long to build infrastructure. Right? So all of Singapore's developments, of course, are within one city because Singapore is only in one city, but in Malaysia, they tend to be in close proximity. So Penang South Island's right next to the city of Penang, Forest City right next to Johor Bahru and also Singapore. So I think that proximity is really important, but they tend to be built in places that are either, well, there's both greenfield and brownfield examples, right? With this, like Nusantara is something of a dead forest, right? It's been overmined and overforested. And so the way that the population and investors have been sold on Nusantara has been as this kind of reforestation process that the forest will be better off for the city being there than it currently is. It's quite a claim. Yeah. I don't know if I buy it, but it's the claim. And that location is a somewhat different scenario in that it isn't all that close to anything. It's close to Balikpapan. It's only actually something like 14 kilometers or something from there, but there's such a windy, circuitous route to get there through the rainforest currently that it takes like an hour and a half to get there by car.
Mm-hmm.
They're working on a plan with the Korean car manufacturer Hyundai to create floating cars that will go from the Balikpapan airport over the rainforest to land in Nusantara. I don't know what the timeline is for completing that, but that's being thought through.
Watch this space.
Right. But actually, the location of East Kalimantan was chosen because it doesn't have an existing population, or at least a very small indigenous local population only, and it's seen as being sort of politically neutral. The majority of Indonesians are Javanese. Javanese are the dominant ethnic group in Indonesia and control almost all government positions in the federal government. And so the idea of having the capital city outside of Java is really critical to selling it to the Indonesian population, that it's not going to enhance Javanese hegemony, and that it's going to have a more central location for the sort of more marginal parts of Indonesia that will be able to access it more easily.
Interesting. Great. Any other final comments, questions? Nothing else. Okay, well, I guess that just leaves me to thank Brent very much for a super fascinating talk. Really enjoyed that. And to remind everybody that we have one more talk in week 4 on workers in the gig economy in East Asia. And yes, thanks again. I maybe we can unmute and show our appreciation in the traditional online form.